Howdy folks. So, as you can see, the car amp is back. So, I installed it in the vehicle and it didn't work, and that sort of confirmed my suspicions that there was something else wrong other than just the high-level input thing, which it is a high-level input amplifier, I've confirmed that, but that's not the main issue. So, I was looking at the data sheet and I found that I had a hunch that there has to be something other than the input, because I could measure an input signal going all the way from the DIN connector into the non-inverting input of the amplifier. So I know the chip is getting the data signal, but it doesn't produce an output when it's on the non-inverting input, but it does when it's on the inverting input, which I've tested. And the only thing internal to the chip that's different between those two is that the non-inverting input has a switch inside the chip which is activated by the mute and standby signals. And you need a minimum of 3.5 volts on the mute and standby lines in order to bring the chip into active mode. So I checked those, and the standby has 3.8 volts on it. It's marginal, but it's okay. The mute, on the other hand, is only 2 volts. That's not enough. So obviously the power supply that drives those is dead. And the power supply is this stuff right here. If you were wondering what this was, this is the what they're using. This line here has a 35 kilohertz square wave that comes out of the switch mode controller, and it goes into these two devices here, these two SOT23s, and then there's a bit of RC stuff going on here. And this is, I think, because there's a power-up sequence for these chips. You basically bring them out of standby first, then you wait a bit, then you bring them out of mute. So that's obviously what they're doing. And I think this is why the mute has failed, because the mute is basically closer to the chip. So it all makes sense. So of course the first thing I suspected were these two SOT23 devices, and I've managed to figure out what they are. The device on the left is a PNP transistor, and the device on the right is a high-speed single diode. Now, the diode is across the transistor, and 2 leads of the transistor are shorted. So I don't know if either the transistor is shorted or the diode is shorted, but one of the two is shorted, and that would explain why we're not getting the right output voltage. So I'm going to desolder the transistor, because I suspect that's probably what's gone, because it's actually what feeds the pin. And I'll pull that out of the circuit, measure again, and see if the short's gone, because if it is, then I'll just have to source a tiny SOT23 PNP, just a generic switching transistor. If it can do 35 kilohertz, it's fine. So either that, or I'll try to bodge a TO92 package on there. I may have to do that, because I don't know if I have any SOT23s. So I just desoldered the PNP transistor you can see here, and that cleared it. So I'm getting the proper diode drop across this, and there's no reverse, which is good. So this is the culprit, this tiny SOT23 device, and I've checked with the diode tester, and I'm getting 0.02 volts drop across here, which I believe is collector to emitter. So yeah, this thing has taken the full brunt of... I'm assuming probably what happened was when the board catastrophically failed underneath this device, it probably shorted the plus or minus 25 volt supplies into this, and this being the first in the chain, it took the brunt of it. So at least we know why it's not working. So I'll source a part, we'll put it in there, and we'll finally get this thing working properly again. I measured some voltages with my scope, and we still have an issue. And the reason I say that has to do with how this circuit is designed. This trace here, you get a 8 volt peak to peak, so it's a plus and minus 4 volt square wave at 35 kilohertz. It comes in, it gets rectified by the diode, and this trace on the other side of the diode here, which you can see goes into the base of this PNP transistor, it sits around 3.8 volts or so. It fluctuates a little bit, but 3.8 volts or so. So it gets smoothed obviously by the stuff on this side a little bit as well. And that seems fine. Now the collector, you would expect the collector to be a higher voltage, such that it effectively gets reduced in voltage. It works sort of like a linear regulator, so that the emitter, which is directly connected to the mute pin on both of the packages, gets somewhere, you know, around 4 or 5 volts or something like that. That's what you'd expect, except you don't see a 12 volt supply or anything on that collector. In fact, you see basically 0 volts. It's something like 300 millivolts. And if you ohm out between this trace here and that, you get about 10 ohms. So I feel like there's something else that's gone wrong down here in the power supply section. So I'm gonna give that a little bit of a probe around and see if I can find anything in here that's possibly shorted, because I get the feeling that that there's something else going on here, because the circuit as it stands doesn't make any sense. So as you can see, I've taken some more components off and I've sliced the board in a couple places, and this node right here, the middle of the voltage divider, is got 17 ohms to ground, so it's basically short to ground. And it seems to be the only part of the circuit that's affected. And at this point, I just don't care anymore about this. So what I'm going to do is, well, in the wise words of Bender from Futurama, I'm going to make my own circuit with hookers and blackjack. Well, okay, maybe not hookers and blackjack, but I'm just going to build my own RC supply here, because this is so far gone that it's kind of unnecessary. I mean, it's got a perfect startup sequence, all this other kind of stuff. I don't really need that. I basically just need to delay the voltage rise on the mute and standby pins by a couple seconds to give the amps a chance to get their full power supplies. I mean, that's all it really needs. So I've just got, I just found a 3K resistor, and this is, I wanted a good quality cap, so all I have is this 680 microfarad 25 volt. This is a Panasonic high quality cap, 105 degrees C rated. That'll outlive the vehicle. And I'll just make an RC filter. I'll just connect that straight up to the pins, and this will all get disconnected. And that should be all that I need to do. So I'll get the soldering iron out, build that up, and show you when it's done. Now I know what you're all gonna say. This looks like a piece of shit. And it does, because I did it once, and then I had to take it all apart, and then I stopped caring when I put it back together again. And this is all temporary, by the way. I would never do something like this. And the reason that I'm saying this now is because I've found where that 17 ohms to ground was coming from. It wasn't an issue in the board. It's this amp module. The standby pin right here is the 17 ohms to ground. So when I desoldered this pin on this device, but I didn't do it on this one. Not sure why, but yeah, that's the problem. So this module, even though the amp part is probably fine, the mute or the standby line is basically shorted to ground. So I can't enable it. So it's unfortunately dead. And these are about $15 plus $20 shipping. At this point, there's no way in hell you'd want this anymore. You just buy a new amp. So it was a 4-channel amp, then it was a 2-channel amp, now it's a 1-channel amp. And at this point, the only reason why I'm continuing with this is because I've gotten this far. I've tested this module. This module, I can feed an input into the non-inverting input, and I get an output. So this module works. As far as I know, it works fine, no issues. So, at this point, I'm just going to tidy this up, I'm going to bridge the outputs in parallel. So we will have one module driving all the speakers in the car. How long this module will last, I don't know. It gets to be about 60 something degrees while it's idling without a heatsink. Now I don't know if that's normal or not. I don't honestly know. It draws about 200 milliamps when it's on. I think that's actually normal. I don't think that's abnormal, because when this is strapped to that big aluminum case, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But I don't know how long this thing's going to last, and I don't know how loud it's going to be. But I've just gotten this far. I have to do something. So I'll be removing some of these components. So the board was never an issue. The components on there, aside from that one transistor, nothing was really an issue. It's just that device has been pulling everything down, and for some reason I've checked everything except it. I don't know, it completely slipped my mind. So I will tidy this up and show you what the final product looks like when it's finally assembled and done. And then there was one. So that's it. It's basically done. So I've tested it. It works. And I've bridged the speakers again in parallel. So there's two sets of two in series in parallel. So the output impedance is actually going to be exactly what it originally was, with just 4 times the number of speakers on it. So we'll see how this thing performs. We'll see if there's any weird hissing or noise issues and stuff like that. We'll just have to install it and find out. I'll probably update the description of the video if everything goes fine. I'm not going to make another video about this unless it's a destruction video, in which case if this still has a fault like that, it probably makes a hissing noise or something like that, then I'll probably destroy this in some fun way. But other than that, hopefully that's the last we see of this project. At this point, obviously, the amount of hours that I put into this was not at all worth it. But, I mean, at the beginning it didn't seem that bad, but as things got further and further into it, it got worse and worse. And I think some of that is partially my fault. I think that that module that just failed, I want to say that I killed that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I did. I'm pretty sure I shorted the pin to the power supply, and that killed it. So, yeah, this was the length of this project was perpetuated by my carelessness. But it is what it is. I mean, it was already fucked. So I mean, you couldn't fuck it anymore. So at least now we've got one channel, and one is better than 0, marginally, but it is. So hopefully this project has been entertaining to watch, I guess. And until next time, thanks for watching.